Rain on the Road to Richmond, Pain, Purpose, and the World-Making of Gabriel's Rebellion, 1800. Storyteller's Voice, Historian's Spine. What follows treats Gabriel's conspiracy not as a footnote of failure, but as a declaration, quietly forged, nearly launched, of human dignity and freedom. 1. The Ground of Sorrow. Turn-of-the-century Virginia was rich in tobacco and poor in mercy. Around Richmond, enslaved men ferried hogsheads on flatboats. Women carded and cooked and cared through the long dusk, and children learned too early the grammar of obedience. The law reached everywhere, into meetings, marriages, movement, mouths. Whippings were public pedagogy. Sales parceled families like lots of land. And yet, inside that choke, a counterworld persisted. Praise houses that hummed after sundown, clandestine letters, stolen hours to read, kin who refused to forget. From this world rose Gabriel, an enslaved blacksmith in Henrico County. He moved between plantation fields and city foundries, listening, learning, noticing where power slept. A blacksmith's trade teaches conversion, raw iron to usable edge, and Gabriel learned to apply that to politics. He measured the distances between farms, the temper of men, the rhythm of patrols, the way fear made rulers careless. He also learned scripture and slogans. Richmond was a city where the words liberty and death had been shouted by white patriots a generation earlier, and he held them to their own echo. 2. Why rise? Grievance, hope, and necessity. The grievance was structural. Nothing short of a system could have produced an answer so large as a citywide rising. Under Virginia's statutes and local practice, the enslaved lived under surveillance, punishment, and the axe at the root of kinship, the auction block. Even many free black neighbors walked inside a ring of suspicion, compelled by registration regimes and curfews to prove, over and over, they had a right to their own names. In the 1790s, slaveholders pressed the legislature to tighten controls on free black mobility and employment, codifying a permanent second class. The hope was political as well as spiritual. The age of revolutions was still audible in the streets. France, Haiti, and the American past provided both inspiration and cautionary tales. Gabriel's plan absorbed the radical promise in those winds that a people could interrupt the usual order of things, seize a seat of power, and negotiate their freedom as a collective, not as isolated petitioners. The slogan his comrades recalled, "Death or Liberty," was less imitation than indictment, a mirror held up to a commonwealth that preached liberty while perfecting bondage. The necessity was geographic and tactical. Richmond could be reached at night from scattered farms by men who knew the roads better than their overseers. An armory, a capital, a governor, these were identifiable levers. The plan was simple because it had to be. Enter Richmond in force, seize the armory and capital, hold Governor James Monroe as a hostage for terms, and compel emancipation. That sequence was not fantasy. It was a clear read of how power might be made to listen in a world that refused to hear. 3. Forging a conspiracy. Work, worship, whisper. A rebellion is built from ordinary things: tools, friendships, prayers, and time. Blacksmith shops became quiet arsenals. Scythe blades hammered into short swords. Iron into spears, shot cast by the dozens. Messages ran along kin networks and work gangs, through praise houses and night markets. Trusted men spoke at field edges while the sun dipped. Women relayed signs and stored food. Free black sailors and teamsters carried word between counties. The recruitment was both broad and careful. Comrades were tested in small risks before being asked to shoulder larger ones. The plan sketched routes into Richmond, named places to rally, counted on sympathizers at key doors. What historians later called Gabriel's Rebellion was in truth a collective enterprise spread across central Virginia, ambitious, practical, and closer to ignition than the state ever wished to admit. 4. The night the sky interfered. Saturday, August 30th, 1800, the rendezvous day. Men moved toward appointed spots with makeshift arms, the road dust clinging to their ankles. Then the weather turned. A violent storm pounded central Virginia, swelled creeks, and turned Richmond's dirt streets to bog. Bridges washed out, torches sputtered. Rain is no ally to a force without barracks or lantern oil to spare. The delay frayed nerves and opened a door to betrayal. 2 enslaved men, fearful or calculating, warned their enslaver, Mosby Shepherd. Word leapt to the governor. James Monroe mobilized militia and patrols. Arrests followed the raindrops. The conspiracy, mighty in intention, lost its one true ally, surprise. Gabriel vanished into the tidewater's eddies, fleeing downriver toward Norfolk. For weeks he evaded capture. At last he was seized, betrayed aboard a schooner by a crewman who exchanged his leader for the promise of reward, and hauled back to Richmond in irons. 5. Courts without juries. The state reasserts itself. To regain its balance and make an example, Virginia did not summon juries. It revived colonial machinery, courts of oyer and terminer, 5 slave-holding justices sitting without a jury, with appeal only to the governor. Trials were swift, testimony often coerced or purchased with the promise of pardon, and the arithmetic grim. Over several weeks in Richmond and surrounding jurisdictions, more than 70 men were arrested. 26 were hanged, others transported or sold beyond the state, a few spared for turning state's evidence. Governor Monroe corresponded with Thomas Jefferson about clemency and policy as the executions advanced, a paper trail that reads like a government struggling to decide how much blood would reassure fear. The spectacle reasserted the law's monopoly on violence, redistributed a portion of the loss to enslavers through compensation for executed property, and tried to pin the entire episode on a handful of ringleaders. An old trick of power: make a structural cry look like a personal crime. 6. Pain that can't be counted. The trade-offs and losses borne by black communities. Lives taken and scattered. The nooses cut off sons, husbands, brothers, friends. Executions fell like scythes into the social fabric. Sales and transports, legal punishments short of death, finished the tearing, scattering families to distant markets. Law sharpened against community. In the rising's wake, Virginia tightened the legal vice. Some measures fell immediately on free black neighbors. Others rippled through the next few sessions. Nighttime gatherings of the enslaved were curtailed by statute. Worship itself, so often a wellspring of organization, became explicitly suspect when black people met without white supervision. What lawmakers would only admit as public order was, in practice, a war on black association, instruction, and hope. Economy of fear. Patrols thickened. Passes were demanded and redemanded. Wages from hiring out were cut or reclaimed. City work became a narrower channel. An ember of literacy, already rare, risked prosecution if it glowed too bright. A conjugal visit across the county line acquired a new price. The chance of a beating, a jail cell, a slave trader's ledger. The moral wound. Betrayals, compelled or voluntary, left scars that statutes cannot record. The man who informed and was freed lived under a gaze he could not escape. White gratitude weaponized as surveillance. Black neighbor's grief curdled into wary silence. The archive is quiet about how he slept. These losses are not a ledger one balances. They are the cost a regime imposed for daring to say we are people out loud. 7. What black people took back anyway. Name, witness, and a widened horizon, agency in public. Even aborted, Gabriel's plan forced Virginia to acknowledge enslaved people as political actors, coordinators, logisticians, theologians of freedom. The state's frantic response, letters to Monticello, militia musters, special courts, confessed as much as it condemned. A people the law called property had behaved like citizens of a future that did not yet exist. A witness that traveled. News of the conspiracy traveled faster than rain. In cities where anti-slavery sentiment was waking, Gabriel's story joined the evidence that slavery was not only immoral, but unstable, that people held in chains do not consent to their bondage. Pro-slavery writers hurried to pathologize the event as fanaticism. Precisely because of its scale and its almost, they had to write harder than usual. A vocabulary of citizenship. Death or liberty was not a borrowed vanity. It was a claim to the Republic's loudest promise. In aligning himself with that phrase, Gabriel and his comrades translated the American creed into a black vernacular of belonging. Even from the scaffold, that translation survived. A repertoire renewed. After 1800, enslaved and free black Virginians did not abandon resistance. They diversified it. Flight, slowdowns, sabotage, clandestine school, purchase of kin, coded sermon, hidden savings. They persisted. And every patrolman's skittishness in the dark was, in a small way, an admission that Gabriel's idea had not been killed, only delayed. 8. How others saw. The gazes that met the rising officials. Monroe's letters show a governor torn between terror and calculation. Punish enough to deter, but not so much as to invite backlash or stain Virginia's reputation. The executions proceeded, but with a few commutations when politics, property, or conscience tugged. In the Assembly, members moved to tighten controls on movement, worship, hiring out, and free black life, choosing order over introspection. The official gaze framed Gabriel as criminal, not just because he broke the law, but because admitting him as a political opponent would have forced the state to debate the law itself. Neighbors. White artisans and farmers across the region met rumor with muskets and anger. Some read the storm as providence. Among black neighbors, there were the full human range of responses: courage and caution, refusal and assent, fear and faith. Women's roles: warning, sheltering, provisioning, deciding. Rarely enter the record, but no movement of this scope proceeds without their logistics and judgment. A broader white public. In the short term, many white Virginians drew the wrong conclusion, that more bars and quicker ropes would make the world safer. In the longer arc, the very need to pass tighter laws and to argue so loudly for slavery's benefits betrayed a quieter panic. Power had seen its reflection and did not like what looked back. 9. Stories from the edges of the archive. The shop at dusk. Two brothers heat a scythe blade until it sings. One hammers, one quenches. They do not call it a sword. They call it a tomorrow. When a neighbor walks by, they talk of horseshoes and hinges. The blade cools under a sack of feed, and their eyes give nothing away. The ferry. A boatman, free black, hired out, or enslaved with permission, angles across the river with two passengers who speak little. He does not want to know more than he already knows. When he sets them down, one looks back as if memorizing a route in case of a night run. The boatman's hands do not shake until the oars are shipped and the river has him alone. The kitchen. A woman needs bread in the dim. She has heard enough to understand the risk, but not enough to judge the plan's odds. She wraps extra loaves anyway, hides them under a cloth, and prays the rain holds off, or, if it must fall, that it does so like a curtain, not a flood. The cell. A man writes nothing because he has nothing to write with. He recites instead verses, names, promises. If any one of those words could unbar iron, the door would already be open. 10. The truth behind the uprisings. To call Gabriel's conspiracy merely a plot is to miss its moral architecture. It was conscience-organized, a bid to transform whispered personhood into public power. Yes, innocents might have died had the force reached the city. Revolutions rarely choose clean geography. But the daily peace slavery enforced was itself a violence without headlines. Mature history refuses to tidy either reality away. The storm spared Richmond a pitched battle. It did not spare Virginia a reckoning. 11. What the storm could not wash away. The rope closed on bodies. It did not close on the idea that the enslaved could be authors of their fate. In the decades after 1800, Gabriel's near rising shadowed courthouses and vestries. It placed a quiet condition on every Virginia boast about order, only so long as you do not hear what we are forced to hear. When later generations walked other roads, Denmark Vesey's Charleston, Nat Turner's Southampton, the memory of a plan nearly carried through Richmond flickered like a lantern on a dark path. The rebellion that didn't quite happen happened enough to change the world around it. Laws bent, patrols thickened, sermons sharpened, and a generation of Black Virginians measured the state's panic and drew their own conclusions. The storm was a character in the story. So was betrayal. So was courage. So was grief. But the protagonist is larger than any weather. A people refusing a future written without them. Gabriel Prosser's Uprising, 1800, USA. The roads that have not yet cleared. Gabriel and the price of a future deferred. A rainy night's strategic map. Gabriel's plan was not vague. It was a diagram that could be drawn on the palm of his hand. Gather on the northern periphery, divided into rotating groups to avoid being swept by patrols. Use short swords from sharpened sides, iron spears, hammers. Seize guns from small outposts before approaching the center. Push straight for the armory and government building. Hold the governor hostage to force a general negotiation. Release, ensure safe movement, and limit retaliation. Prepare a retreat route via ferries, with a skilled oarman to pivot if the militia forces merge too quickly. In that structure, the key element is surprise, not superior firepower. The heavy rains had robbed an army without ammunition and barracks of the very thing it needed. Tactically, the night of August 30th was a brutal lesson. Many uprisings were lost not because of courage, but because of weather, broken bridges, blown torches, broken communications. Small details but significant enough to derail a historical vehicle. B. Steel and the Forge, the political economy of the trade in chains. Gabriel was a blacksmith. The blacksmith trade taught one to read the character of materials. Some iron could only withstand compression. Some could only be bent after tempering. Some brittle and needed to cool slowly. He applied that logic to slave society. The structure of power was like a sheet of rolled steel, shiny on the outside, long fibers on the inside that could crack when force was applied to the right spot. The urban labor market, which hired enslaved people to do public work, was both a chain and a window. Moving, listening, networking. Tools were a silent language. A sharpened scythe aroused no suspicion. A batch of nails larger than usual could be turned into homemade lead bullets. Spare pieces of iron were the promise of another day. In the forge, discipline was not an abstract virtue. It was a condition of survival. It is likely that the discipline of the craft itself bled into organizational discipline, the yardstick by which Gabriel sifted through those who could keep secrets, endure, and complete tasks without boasting. C. Liberation theology, when the Bible speaks the language of iron. In those days, prayer meetings were political schools without chalkboards. The story of Exodus, the cry, "Let my people go," the prophecy of justice, all created a spiritual vocabulary for action. Gabriel and his associates did not simply speak freedom. They named the sin of a legal but inhuman order. The power of liberation theology lies in its recentering of morality. No one can use the excuse of order to obscure the question of on whose bones it rests. And when a community has a language to name its pain, it has a mental map to navigate. D. Black women, hands holding the fire outside the frame. Most state-held records barely name women. But if we look at the logistics, bread hidden in towels, clean water in jars, secret words passed through the market, we see the trajectory of those who do not speak. They weigh the risks every day, helping husbands, brothers, sons without bringing the knife down on their families. They coordinate news through the pretense of buying and selling, visiting, attending ceremonies, a scope that is harmless enough to the eyes of patrols but wide enough to connect villages to the riverbanks. They keep the memory. When defeat comes, they bury, evacuate, collect the remains of their lives and ritualize the pain so that the community does not fall apart. In other words, if the night of August 30th is a fire that is put out by rain, then women are the ones who keep the ashes so that the fire can be rekindled in the collective memory. E. Courts and money. Justice as a balance sheet. After the panic, the state pulls everything into the framework of legal ritual. The Oyer and Terminer court has no jury. The judge is the slave owner. The trial time is short. But behind the language of justice is accounting. Who to hang, who to sell, who to pardon. Each decision ties into the purse of the slave owner through the mechanism of destroyed property. The court minutes are both a stage of control and a bill to the treasury. The presence of the governor and the correspondence with politicians show that the government wants to monopolize violence and monopolize the story, to turn the collective cry into the crime of a few zealots. Such justice does not seek truth, it seeks stability. And stability, in the eyes of a slave order, means silencing the voice of the people. F. Comparison. From Richmond, 1800, to Charleston, 1822, and Southampton, 1831. Richmond, 1800. Gabriel. Strategy of capturing the center of power. Hostages. Negotiations. Weaknesses. Weather dependence and secrecy. Once exposed, it is gone. Charleston, 1822. Denmark Vesey. Extensive network in the city. Planned escape by sea. Disrupted by informants and dense surveillance. Southampton, 1831. Nat Turner. Apocalyptic theology. Rapid deployment. Moral shock to the whole state. Crushed by militia and courts, followed by a tightening of the law. The series of 3 events tells us one thing: the enslaved are not passive. They try 3 different models of action in 3 different situations, and all 3 force the government to